So today I'd like to discuss, I've been asked to discuss with you global and international affairs, a fairly blank canvas, but there are some things I'd like to paint onto it. But before I do, I'll set the stage and inform all of you that I just returned with John Connell, of course, right, from Taiwan and Japan. And I was the first member of Congress to visit in this session, and it was fascinating. I've never visited those two countries before. Visited government leaders, business leaders, some civil society leaders as well, and we share, it turns out, with some exceptions here and there, because Taiwan in particular is a complicated place, but we share a great anxiety about and generally an animus towards the Chinese Communist Party. That wasn't a surprise to me. I thought that that would be a theme I'd be able to tease out over the course of the visit, but the extent to which that is a very concrete threat as opposed to an abstract evening news threat really came to life. The Taiwanese and the Japanese, to a lesser extent, live every day, and their government leaders spend most of the day thinking about the threat of an actual invasion of the homeland. But it's more than that. It's a psychological threat. It's a concern about manipulation of their elections. It's a concern about something we'll discuss today, economic coercion, on and on and on. And it was refreshing to know that those countries, Mr. Minister, those countries who are on the front lines of this, what will probably be a multi-generational, not just a generational competition of values and systems, are taking it very seriously. Their leaders of their institutions are stepping up and making bold reforms, sometimes to the great consternation of some of their citizens, because reforms require oftentimes sacrifice. That's a universal sentiment, by the way. People don't like to make sacrifices, right? It takes some leadership. So it's a fascinating trip. The reason I prioritized the trip, in addition to just trying to get insight and become a more knowledgeable member of the United States Senate, and have some integrity to my appearances where I talk about these things that I've read about, and I visit ministers when they come to my office, was I thought it was important to communicate that there's bipartisan unity. There are some exceptions, but there's generally strong bipartisan unity in Congress that we have to take this competition seriously, that we have to push aside many of our partisan instincts and impulses and temptations, and we too have to make some sacrifices. We too, as leaders and as individuals, have to make some risks, and that is happening. We've seen it over here with Chairman Gallagher's China committee, and I have so far been quite encouraged by the tone, tenor, and cadence of that committee. Seems, for the most part, pretty buttoned up and very serious. So there's bipartisan unity in Congress on the necessity, specifically, I think, of supporting Taiwan, because with few exceptions, I think folks understand that that is the tripwire for a much larger effort that might be underway for the Chinese to gain some measure of control, even dominance in the Asia-Pacific, and that too will impact all of us quite directly. I was persuaded on this trip that, it's generally believed that this is a longer-term threat, that the Chinese Communist Party is just kind of laying the groundwork through the People's Liberation Army and all the various instruments of power at Xi Jinping's disposal. And we don't have to worry about an actual invasion. We don't have to worry about a potential embargo of this important island nation that produces computer chips and on for some period of time. I'm no longer of that opinion. In fact, I think I have a minority view that says over the next few years, this is the most dangerous time. It's the most dangerous time in part because of what I perceive to be the psychology of Xi Jinping. His leadership is very quietly being questioned right now. He reigns all supreme, but he is not bowled a perfect game, as we like to say in Indiana. His interventions in the property market, in the technology market, did not work. His zero COVID policy has been an absolute disaster. The demographic projections of he and his ministers are not coming to fruition. It appears that India, not China, by year's end, may be the most populous country in the world. And the bear has been poked, the bear being the United States and our friends and allies. As I already asserted, and I think most agree, we're starting to get our act together. I recently visited with former Secretary of Defense Gates, spent 2 days with Bob Gates down in Williamsburg, and you know, when you have an experience like that, you sit down. We were talking about strategic communications, but it was on a polo side where he and I were having a drink and just engaged in fairly casual conversation that to me was most memorable. And he just said something off the cuff. He said, you know, I think the communists are really concerned right now. They're concerned because, you know, they have poked the bear. The United States is starting to get its act together. Congress is starting to get serious again, at least as it relates to this issue. And the Chinese are smart. They know that's the case. And they know that there's some urgency. And he said, and this focused my mind, if we can get the next few years right, if we can just make sure we're headed in the right direction, there's going to be no stopping us. And I feel that way as well. So with that in mind, I want to focus my fairly brief remarks here today on a couple of key points, some areas that I'm really focused on. I'm not going to talk about the entire U.S.-China competition because A, I'm ill-equipped to do so, and B, we'd be here for a few weeks. So I have carved out, after a dozen years on Capitol Hill, when everybody emphasizes on day one, you have to know what you're specializing in. Yeah, no one knows how to do that. Romney came in, I asked Romney, like, this guy's really smart, very successful. He knows how to be a good manager and set priorities. And I said, you know, man, I got a question for you. What are you going to specialize in? You know, you've got such an amazing background. Where are they say 2 or 3 areas, where are they going to be? He says, I got like 50. And I don't know. So, I mean, that's kind of how I feel. But once you get started in something, once you meet with success in an area, it's really pretty exciting. So today I'm going to focus on a couple of those areas where I see a continued opportunity for maybe me to help shape the future to the benefit of our country and our way of life. Chips and science, that one won't surprise you. And the second one is economic coercion. I will elaborate, and you will hear a lot more about it. Prime Minister Kishida showed a lot of leadership following Prime Minister Abe's leadership in the area of economic coercion. So first, on implementation of the Chips and Science Act. I'm not going to talk about child care. I'm not going to talk about union wages. I could, but that would be boring. We have a national security imperative. I've said it before. Jim may quote it someday, but we cannot fall behind China in certain discrete areas of technological innovation. Our system is better. Our system of broad and deep capital markets and freewheeling entrepreneurs and visionaries who can go out there and identify market demand. But there's some parts of our system that need public investment, pre-market investments in areas for which there is not, at least not yet, market demand. hypersonics. There aren't a lot of consumers that are craving a hypersonic this or that because they don't exist yet. It's analogous to Tang, right? No one wanted Tang until we sent somebody up in space. That's why we went to space. Did you know that? I'm seeing if you're awake. That didn't make any sense. Kind of the point. You're all awake now. I've got a silly dimension to my personality. It's okay, right? I got to keep it real. So we got to get implementation of CHIPS and Science, the CHIPS and Science Act, right. On my role in the Foreign Relations Committee, I'm doing my part. Of course, a lot of this falls within the Commerce Committee, on which I also sit. But I think few people know about the State Department dimension of CHIPS and Science. It's really important. In fact, it's so important that of different legislation that's worked its way through Congress, you will hear Tony Blinken talk about CHIPS and Science more than any other. He has all kinds of diplomats and other government leaders from around the world who consistently approach him and says, how can we be part of that? How can we be part of the research, the development, the shoring up of supply chains? How can we be part of this network of participants that are looking to harden ourselves against Chinese intervention? There's also a lot of resources that we have dedicated towards this very activity. We've given the State Department and our diplomats an International Technology, Security, and Innovation Fund for this very purpose, to train them and equip them to convene and to go around the world and figure out how we can mutually collaborate on issues of what I will broadly define as tech diplomacy. Semiconductor supply chains, tech security, export controls. This is sort of the project-based learning of our diplomatic corps right now. It's in this area, facilitated by the CHIPS and Science Act. Agreements on sourcing materials for chips, expanding the network of countries to package advanced semiconductors. Packaging is not putting things in a bag for the uninitiated. It's figuring out, now that we can put so many transistors on a chip, how do you then stack them up vertically in a way that can maximize efficiencies, reducing energy input, increasing processing power? We need to work with others, the best minds in the world, crowd in the very, very best, their treasure as well as their intellectual firepower to get this right. Last week I raised this fund that I alluded to with Secretary Blinken during a Foreign Relations Committee hearing, and he affirmed that it's not only a first-order priority for him, but he is working daily with Secretary Raimondo, who's been the most visible, leader in this space, to ensure that the Commerce Department, with its funding authorities, with its oversight over the export controls, is working hand in glove with their diplomats. The 21st century, stepping back, 21st century economy is going to be driven by who has access to these next generation capabilities. This is the fourth, or depending on how you're counting them, this is the fifth industrial revolution. It's the harnessing of these technologies, but first you have to be able to develop the best ones. Who's going to play that central role in developing and supplying peoples with those technologies? If it's China, then we're locking ourselves into a mercantilist, communist ideology. The technologies of the future cannot have the biases of the Chinese Communist Party, anti-Uyghur, anti-privacy built into them. Moreover, if you can control the railroad gauges, the parameters of the digital economy, then you can foreclose people from participating, you can limit their participation, you can shape the terms of their participation. So this is foundational. The effort to bring back chips manufacturing to the U.S. is just one line of effort in this overall theme. The and science portion of the Chips and Science Act is something we talk less about now, but I think in the long run may be more consequential than the chips piece. This was investment in broadening supply chains, innovating around challenges by resourcing the very, very best minds in the world through our research universities. And oh, by the way, these researchers, yes, of course, are excited about the new grant funding, but they're also excited, so many of them, about being enlisted into this competition of values. They understand that their breakthroughs in solid state physics, in hypersonics, can be used by our warfighters, can be used by our innovators and entrepreneurs to help grow our economy, which in turn will resource our way of life. Very excited. After all, that's one of the reasons people enter professions that may not historically be highly compensated. They want to be part of something meaningful, something important. People are very excited about that. Along with the CHIPS Act, I'll pivot, but don't think I'm done beating that dead horse, folks. It takes a long time to get something done around here, right? But I'm focused on the CCP's aggressive tactics used to economically coerce other nations. They are weaponizing economic interdependence. You know, people like myself celebrated economic interdependence, the linkages between nations. We thought it would, almost as though by an invisible hand, lead to peace and harmony. And there is that incentive, but there's also a countervailing force that the Chinese have really revealed to us, and that is using economic coercion as a cudgel to force the Australians, there you go. If you have some bold leaders who speak out and say, you know, I really think it's time, you tell us what happened with COVID. The world needs to know. We don't want another one of these. Xi, could you release the information? We don't feel like we've got a thorough vetting. No more wine. No more wine from Australia. Yeah. If the Taiwanese leader becomes a little, they decide to, they want a little longer leash. Say, yeah, we need some freedom. You know, China kind of lay off a little bit. No more tourists to Taiwan. You know, while we're at it, I know your pineapple growers send 80% of their pineapples into China. No more pineapples, too. This happens on a daily basis. This is economic coercion, perhaps best explained by offering examples like that. But I could give you countless examples where this is occurring, and not just across the Asia Pacific. Lithuania has been on the receiving end of Chinese coercion, for example. Senator Coons and I have come up with a solution. And like all solutions, it won't be perfect, but we think this one could be powerful. We reintroduced the Countering Economic Coercion Act last month. It gives the president certain authorities that he or she don't currently have, and in short, if you're a small island nation in the Pacific and you're being economically coerced by the Chinese Communist Party and you need help today, the president can say, okay, we're going to just first have to have a demonstrated finding that you were coerced. That shouldn't be difficult in this simple scenario I put forward. Number two, the president will say, okay, we're going to invite your exports into the United States. We're going to eliminate or significantly lower certain tariff or non-tariff barriers. If there are any regulations that are complicating your efforts to export into our country, we're going to either waive those or alter those to accommodate you. And while we're at it, we're going to try and facilitate more exports into your country of any key items needed by your consumers and for other purposes. So the president would, of course, if you're thinking, wow, this is a clever way and run around the Trade Promotion Authority process. Ultimately, Congress would have to sanction this after a fairly short period. But we think if the United States does this and then aligns our policy, as we're in the process of doing, even before this legislation is passed, with the Japanese, with the Australians, with the Europeans, and so many others, then we can have almost an economic NATO, although I don't anticipate a required participation. This would be a sort of a one-off situation, but this would give nations a clear alternative to China and Chinese coercion moving forward. So hopefully we can move forward with this legislation in short order. The G7 is in Hiroshima this year in May. Might be a good outing for the Ripon Society.
Only 14 hours from here.
Yeah, exactly. But this will be the top pillar of emphasis because of Prime Minister Kishida's great leadership in this area. So we're really looking forward to that. So rather than, I think my time is going tighter than I would like because I'd like to receive some questions. So I'll dispense with the literary flourish. I'll thank you for your time and attention, and I'll look forward to taking questions.
Great, Tom. Thank you very much.